A Hard Day's Night, then, is the movie that goes with the film of the same name. The album was recorded between February and June of 1964, remembering that the film came out that summer in 1964. The album was released in 1964, July, and quickly went to #1 in the UK and the US. Now, when you look at the release of singles, between the previous album and A Hard Day's Night, you'll see that during this period, there's not a lot of release of new material. And that's because as the Beatles were having success in the US, there was a tremendous backlog, as I mentioned in the last video, of older material that they still hadn't worked fully. You know, you don't want to step on your own sales. And so they were busy during the first half of 1964 re-releasing in the US material that some of it had been released by VJ and others, just had not sold very well. But now, of course, it was selling like hotcakes. So they didn't want to bring out any new product that would step on that. And A Hard Day's Night was the sort of new product that came out about halfway through 1964 in the summer of that year. Can't Buy Me Love and A Hard Day's Night both went to #1 in both the US and the UK as singles. I'll Cry Instead, backed with I'm Happy Just to Dance With You, went to #25 in this country. And I Love Her and If I Fell went to #12 in this country. Interestingly, the Hard Day's Night album has no cover songs on it at all. Remember with the previous albums, there were cover songs there, but here there are no cover songs. They're all songs by Lennon and McCartney, and mostly by John Lennon. So 10 of the songs, the original songs on this album, are by John Lennon, with 3 of them being songs by Paul McCartney. There was a US soundtrack album of this that was released. Remember, we're following the UK release of it, but the US release, of course, cut a bunch of tunes off and put in some of George Martin's orchestral music from the movie so that they could stretch that other Beatles material out and sell it to you again in a different form, in a different way. In fact, we'll talk at the end of this lecture other ways that they figured out of packaging this besides just singles and LPs. So the John songs on the record that we have are A Hard Day's Night, I Should Have Known Better, If I Fell, I'm Happy Just to Dance With You, Tell Me Why, Anytime at All, I'll Cry Instead, When I Get Home, You Can't Do That, and I'll Be Back. And if you recall that the general rule is that if a song is written by John, it tends to be sung, the lead vocal tends to be done by John. If it's written by Paul, the lead vocal tends to be done by Paul. There's an awful lot of John lead vocal on this album. The Paul songs, And I Love Her, Can't Buy Me Love, and Things We Said Today. Turning to the musical features of this album, in many ways it's a lot like the 2 previous records. That is, we're still getting a kind of audio snapshot, although because of their increasing use of overdubbing with Paul, for example, sometimes on piano and bass both, you're actually getting more musicians on the track than there are guys in the band. But most listeners can't tell the difference. It really pretty much sounds like the band's right in front of you playing, or it's a pretty good illusion of a live performance. So the instrumentation is still pretty much rock instrumentation. We haven't gotten to any important orchestral instruments or exotic instruments like the sitar or anything like that here. We're basically dealing with guitars, drums, bass, some piano, and vocals. There continues to be a pervasive use of AABA form. 8 of the 13 songs on the album use AABA form. And remember that the reason why I keep coming back to this AABA form idea is because for me, this is an indicator of the Beatles sort of using a craftsman-like technique to mold a song. You know, finding the form that they know will work again and again and again like a craftsperson does. And so seeing still the pervasive use of AABA gives us a kind of indication of what their mindset is with the album. This is one of the reasons why I think of this again as the kind of pinnacle of their craft approach. This is going to morph with the next album to something that's much more artist-based, but for now it's craft. We might say, okay, 8 out of 13. What about those other 5 songs? What do they do? Well, Tell Me Why, Anytime at All, and When I Get Home, all John songs, use a contrasting verse-chorus form that also sort of fits a bridge in. So it's a contrasting verse-chorus type of form, meaning that there's a verse and a chorus, and they use contrasting music. It isn't the same music used for the chorus as the verse. But then instead of just having verse, verse, chorus, like those kinds of songs typically have, there'll be verses and choruses, and then there'll be a bridge section which contrasts it. That's more characteristic of an AABA form. So you get 3 songs, all John songs, that use that on this album. I'll Be Back is an interesting one because it is I guess it's a modified version of the AABA form, but it adds a second bridge. So when you actually sort of scan the entire thing out, there's an introduction, then AAB, AAC, AABA, and then a coda. That's a strange form. In fact, if you look in the Dowding book, I think John Lennon Dowding has Lennon down as saying, there's something about the form of that song I'm not quite satisfied with or whatever, because he didn't really write one that did exactly that. He'd sort of fallen a little bit away from the model that he'd been used before. And the 5th one is one that we'll spend a little bit more time talking about in the next video, and that is Can't Buy Me Love, because it repeats that Beatles contrasting verse-chorus form we talked about last week with regard to She Loves You. So while I want to characterize this as an album dominated by Beatles' craft as far as the music and the arranging and the performing and everything goes, some novel musical features do begin to emerge on this record. Now, if we didn't know where this story was headed, we probably wouldn't notice these things so much. So there's a sense of me making a lot of things that really are very small details, but knowing that those small details become increasingly important, and the idea of novelty or doing new things in the songs becomes more and more a part of the Beatles' working methods. We want to trace where do we sort of see the first kinds of signs of that. This album's got a few of them in it. For example, the song If I Fell is a very interesting tune. It's a song that starts with a kind of introduction before the song proper. Used to find these in Tin Pan Alley songs all the time. Before the actual song would start, there's a big sort of setup to the song. In fact, those are called, in Tin Pan Alley songs, sectional verses. For example, a song like I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas actually has a whole beginning part you usually don't hear, but it's part of the song, where the singer talks about being in sunny Southern California, and it really doesn't seem like Christmas in Southern California because the sun is shining, and where's the snow and all of that kind of thing that goes with Christmas. So then he goes into song and says, I'm dreaming of a white Christmas. And so this idea of setting the song up, well, If I Fell has one of those kinds of introductions. So again, an indication of the Beatles as students of American popular music. What's interesting about it is, the entire thing starts off as if it's going to be in the key of D flat. Now, if you're not a music person or musician, you don't exactly know what that means. That's not important. The important thing is to know that it starts like it's going to be in D flat, but halfway through this little introduction, it shifts so that the song continues in D major. Now, the key of D flat and the key of D major are right next to each other because they're only a half step apart on the piano or in music, but in terms of key areas, they're very different places. And it's like the beginning of the song can't decide whether it's going to be in D flat or D major, and eventually settles for D major. What's interesting is the lyrics of the song are about a guy who can't decide whether he wants to stay with one girl who's already hurt him or go with the other girl who says that she loves him, and he wants assurances that if he goes with her, please tell me that you won't hurt me like she did, and this kind of thing. And so he's pretty much between two relationships trying to decide. The beginning of the song is really stuck between two different keys. Now, do I think John Lennon thought, I need a harmonic interpretive device in order to project in a very real musical way some of the things I'm talking about in my lyrics? No. Most creative people, even classical music people, don't think in those kinds of terms. That's the way people who explain the music speak. What happens with John Lennon is he's looking for something that musically seems to reflect what it is that he's trying to say. right? And so he follows his nose, like many good musicians do, follows his instincts and sort of finds the thing that works. What's interesting about that is that's a compositional, not a particularly craft-oriented kind of thing. It's looking for a solution for a particular kind of musical or song kind of problem. And so we see that in that little detail of If I Fell, we see a little bit of what's going to happen much more often in the music to follow. Another interesting thing we might point to is a key change that occurs in the guitar solo in And I Love Her. The minute the nylon string guitar solo comes in, there's a key change there that's kind of a jolt. I don't know exactly why they did it, whether it made it easier for George to play or whether that was something that Paul was going to do after the solo and they decided to do it before the solo as a kind of an interesting kind of thing. But it really does kind of stand out as a kind of a novel feature for that tune. There's also what I'm going to call the motivic use of a particular chord in A Hard Day's Night. And we're going to have a musical close-up on A Hard Day's Night in the next video, so I won't spend too much time talking about that right now. But I do want to draw your attention to the fact that there is another John song here, A Hard Day's Night, where one of the musical features that occurs is introduced at the beginning and reused in a couple of different ways during the course of the tune. When we do that in classical music, you take a particular musical figure and then rework it in various ways. We call that motivic work. So somebody like Beethoven, for example, is famous for that. So we see a bit of that kind of thinking going on in A Hard Day's Night with the motivic use of what we'll call the flat 7 chord. I'll come back to that in the next video. Before we go on to those musical close-ups, though, I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about another release that came out in the UK just before the release of A Hard Day's Night. This is the Long Tall Sally EP. Now EPs are something called, well, they're extended play singles. They usually contain 4 songs. They're kind of like a mini album. And EPs sold a lot more in the UK than they ever sold in the US. And what an EP did, it gave the record label a way of giving people a little bit more than a single, but less than an album. It was a different way of packaging material. So oftentimes, it was material that had been packaged either with the single or with the album, so it was a kind of an in-between solution for people who wanted more than what they got with the single, but didn't want to pay as much as they would have to pay for an album. So this was actually the 5th Beatles EP to be released. A couple had been released in the US right after their initial success, and a couple had been released previously in the UK. It was released on June the 19th of 1964 and went to #1 in the UK on the EP chart, but wasn't released in this country. The reason why it's interesting to us and the reason why I'm focusing on this particular EP at this time is because it brings 4 songs forward that belong to this period that we wouldn't find out about until later if we followed the American versions. One original song by John called I Call Your Name, and then 3 covers. Here's where the covers are. They weren't on A Hard Day's Night, but now they're on this Long Tall Sally EP. We get Long Tall Sally, a Little Richard song, sung by Paul, Slow Down, a Larry Williams song, sung by John, and Matchbox, a Carl Perkins song, sung by Ringo. So this Long Tall Sally EP is put together with the Past Masters CD, if you're looking at your CDs to sort of find that music, or if you're downloading it, however you're doing it. And so it's almost like it's one of the only 2 cases in this course will really focus any attention on EPs, even though you should be aware there are a whole sequence of EPs that parallel the singles and the albums here. We're kind of ignoring them because they duplicate content, but in this case they don't duplicate content. The other case that we'll talk about a couple of weeks from now is the Magical Mystery Tour EP, which was never released as an album, but rather as a double EP. It wasn't quite album length, but it was enough to have enough for 2 EPs. And so there we go with the album and leading us through the first half of 1964. Let's take a minute now to look at 3 songs in a little bit more close-up way. A Hard Day's Night, Can't Buy Me Love, and Anytime at All.